Contrast Security enables organizations to secure their applications from development to production. By embedding security sensors within software, Contrast automatically and continuously detects vulnerabilities in both custom and open source code while developers write code, providing them with context-specific how-to-fix guidance for easy and fast remediation. At the same time, by identifying only true vulnerabilities that pose risk and eliminating those that do not, Contrast empowers developers and security teams to prioritize and focus on only those vulnerabilities that matter. Learn how Contrast can help you secure your applications from development through production at securityweekly.com/contrast.
Hello, and welcome back to Application Security Weekly. To continue to news, press 1. I'm your host, Mike Shima, joined by John Kinsella. And we have some announcements as well before we go into the news. We're getting there. In an overabundance of caution, we have decided to flip this year's Security Weekly Unlocked to a virtual format. Safety of our listeners and hosts is our #1 priority. We will miss seeing you all in person, but we very much hope you can still join us on Security Weekly Unlocked virtual. It's almost like a CSB, SWUV, something. I'm lost my train of thought there. I'm going to make something clever. So imagine I said something clever that makes you very excited to come check out this event that's taking place this Thursday, December 16th from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. Eastern. You can still register for free at securityweekly.com/unlock. And please don't forget to check out our library of on-demand webcasts and technical trainings at securityweekly.com/on-demand. Now, we have quite a bit of news, of course. And I want to preface it, there's a great reaction from Jurassic Park that I think is appropriate here. Dr. Elliot, Sam Neill character, is being explained to why the dinosaurs are all female. They won't reproduce. But of course, you used frog DNA and life found a way. Well, if we substitute Log4J into that scene, we're pretty much in the same situation. It's dark, and the velociraptors are coming. In order to help me learn more about this Log4j situation, I have our special guest, our scientist, John Kinsella. John, how do you want to introduce this?
Can I put that on my resume? I'm a not even just Java expert. I'm a Log4j expert. That's awesome. Let's see. How do we want to put this? So that this is let's imagine all our listeners actually they've had their head very well hidden over the last 4 days. Because this is being now broadcast by multiple governments to man the battle stations. Log4j is a logging library. Let's see if this keeps working. My power's going out. It's a logging library. Wow, I actually survived. That's impressive. I'm in the middle of a storm here. It's a logging library which is for Java. What the idea being here is, if you're any type of professional coder in pretty much any modern language, you could do a printf or something to just spit out log lines, but most of us have a little bit more sophistication than that now, I hope. So we use some sort of which allows us to either maybe send logs to a different location, or we can do log criticalities so that when we're in development, we can put out debug logs, but once we go to production, we only spit out production level or like an error log, right? You don't want to have all your debug logs in prod. So that's where Log4j originated. I have used this many times over the years as a Log4j expert. I have left many projects probably with this. Sorry, guys, wherever you are today, because I don't do Java. So as with most modern packages, which there's a long lead in here, sorry, but we're getting somewhere. With most modern packages, libraries out there, you always add features and functionality over time, right? Someone says, hey, wouldn't it be cool if, and next thing you know, something's been added into the library. So that's what happened with Log4j here in a nutshell. For our listeners out there who might be, let's take a step back. And actually, you had a few articles in here, Mike. One from Lunasec, and I know there's a few others in there. I might add one more. There's a really great write-up from Sophos's Naked Security on this whole topic, where they actually walk through with like sample code. First, here's some Java code. Make sure that you can compile that, like get all the tools, and then here's the actual code which will break. But really, to sort of keep it simple for here on air, what's going on is if you think about printf, whether that's in something a Java version, a Go version, a C version, any type of it's a a output command that takes initially a format string, which says, hey, I want a number, allows you to do things like saying, hey, I want a number that is 4 digits, a decimal, and then 3 more digits, right? So it lets you control things like that, or says a string could be no more than 20 characters. So it allows you to, that type of flexibility is wanted in a logging package, because maybe you don't want to spit out the whole, so I could see someone try to do it from a security point of view, saying that, hey, we don't want to put the whole crypto key out there, but let's display the first, public key. Let's display the first 10 characters so that if we're going through the logs and we see that, we might have a chance of going back and seeing which one of our keys actually was in there. That's a bad example, but off the top of my head. So they kept going with this to the point that they said, hey, the problem with this when you do this type of unvalidated input, if you're doing if you take that example I just said with the format here, and you go a little bit further and you say, I want my caller to be able to specify what that format is. So instead of having a, let's see some really quick on-the-fly code for people who can visualize this, printf open param quote $, parenthesis s / end quote, and then you have so that'd be a way to print out a string and have a new line, right? So instead of having that first part, which I was yammering through the nerdity, the within the quotes, that could be passed into it as a variable from somewhere else. You might be thinking you're doing yourself a favor, allows you to dynamically modify what your format is and what you're putting out, right? That sounds sort of cool. People are probably getting a hint a little bit close where we're going here. It turns out one of the options which you have within the Log4j's particular formatting library. So in other words, I mentioned, a %s could be for a string, %d could be for a number, %x I think it is for a hexadecimal value. We're getting a little bit closer to the prize here. But one of those, I think it was %x actually, allows you to actually not just put something out, but to do execution. It's not %x, something else. But at that point now, you've now said, hey, I want you to actually not just have a dynamic formatting phrase, but a dynamic calculation, shall we say, of what that format looks like. Okay, well, now we're giving someone the power not just to say what our format string is, but actually be able to do some sort of calculation or request calculation just to print something out or log something. And the friends out there figured out that, hey, we can use that to our advantage and actually have that do all sorts of different types of things. What could you do with that? Well, let's keep on going a little bit further. And someone figured out that within Java, you have something called JNDI. I'm not doing this off the top of my head. Java native, oh man, I'm going to lose it. It's basically a way of doing dynamic lookups and dynamically accessing probably third-party tools outside of your Java application. So a JNDI could be for LDAP, it could be for a remote code execution, it could be for a bunch of different things, but it's a standard and a format of a URL in this particular case, which allows you to say, hey, go run that thing over there. So to wrap this up, someone figured out with that you can actually do something like you can put in a format which says, hey, go run this thing, and then the thing you tell it to go run would be a JNDI to actually go and execute outside of your program. So you've now got a code breakout. And once you've got that, unfortunately, many of these situations, it's sort of game over, right? So I hope that makes sense. I'll shut up for a second, Mike. Tell me if I'm off by 10 miles or where do we want to go from there?
No, I think you brought us a good steps into that for the Java naming and directory interface, the JNDI, which is why LDAP is important here, because LDAP is that lookup. And what John was describing is basically if we created a parameterized queries for SQL injection, except if you could use a special format to say here is curly braces $, and then have a raw SQL query inside your parameterized query parameter, as I'm reusing a lot of those names, is basically macro substitution to execute arbitrary code or to execute arbitrary connection that pulls in a remote blob of Java that deserializes it and executes it and as John correctly put, game over, man, game over, to quote Hicks. I think there's a couple things, and thank you, John, for that good background into this about how it came across. Some other dimensions I'd add to that is that here's a feature that was introduced in 2013 that it's not clear, or at least it wasn't clear to me in the research I was trying to do on this, how many people were asking for such a macro substitution and capability for their logging program, but it was at least requested. in the Log4j version 2.0, introduced in 2013. There was, in fact, a pretty good Black Hat presentation in 2016 that was focused on JNDI and LDAP. Now, it didn't have the dimensions of Log4j necessarily, but it was pointing out all the fun ways that you could abuse this type of protocol and this type of macros to request environment variables, connect out to remote systems. Also pointing out that LDAP, while everyone is primarily talking about that because that's what the original proof of concept, it's not the only mechanism for making these outbound calls.
Yep.
But where I wanted to go is a little bit of the broader picture here. And, we already picked apart some of this, as you were mentioning, John, mixing data and code. It's a little bit of that. There's a big difference between printf or log4j affecting the format of the output versus actually executing code paths within your system. But we could start to talk about, what about secure defaults? What about deprecating features? Recently the Log4j maintainers have said, we don't really like this feature. We do think it's a bit of a problem, and we'd like to get rid of it, but there's a backwards compatibility here. And of course, we could talk about Microsoft and how they've been hobbled, and but with the backwards compatibility to execute code in binaries that were written 20 years ago that can still run on a modern Windows system. So there's a couple different directions we can go here, but there's a lot to talk about, and now I'm doing all the talking. But so let me pause there and see. Choose your own adventure, Mr. Kinsella.
Choose your own direction. Which way do I want to go?
Yes, exactly.
I like the idea of secure defaults, so let's go down that path for a second. I think, and it's funny, man. We were just was talking with someone earlier today about, we've talked about on the show before, the beauty about React. And we see this in some other languages too, or frameworks where you might have, how will I say, risky either function calls or parameters or, different types of code that, maybe not something you want the beginner to be doing. Or if you use them, you want them to have, where I'm getting to is you have some sort of unique name on it so that it's very easy to find by a static analyzer. We're going to be talking about more about those fun things later. In this case, a static analyzer could be grep, right, if you have like insecure as part of your function name. I've been all gaga for feature flags for the last few months. So I think what I'd really like to see is maybe for something like this, have the default set of what your formatting strings is be safe. And then maybe if someone wants to do something which isn't safe, then you use an insecure version of that logging command or a printf or whatever have you. Because, it's one of those, I can't remember, I'm not sure what Log4j, but I know with like a modern C printf or even goes, if you go and look at the number of escape sequences which can be used in there for all these different types of things, it's a quite a large stretch. And I'm guessing that 80-90% of us use maybe 6 or 8 of them. So there's a lot of stuff that could just be turned off, right? We talk, my last startup, we were talking about, if the ability to see what part of an application is being used or if a library is being used, and if it's not being used, just turn it off, or the same with the container image. It's that same sort of thing here. Hopefully a good compiler would, if you're not using that part of the library, just don't compile it into the binary. And I know some of that stuff happens automatically, but still there's enough that has to be there to support this type of functionality. So if you could just turn that stuff off by default or not use that command, I think that'd be a pretty huge win. The last 2 seconds on that one, your logging command is what got you compromised, or your logging framework. That's just, and there's nothing bad about it, right? But I think for, we had Francesco on last hour, half hour, we were talking about all these really fairly complex enterprise things like asset management, vulnerability management, automation, patch management, all these type of crazy things. And it comes down to the library to use for logging, probably we think is the most innocuous part of your application, is what got you bitten. And that's sort of unfortunate.
It is, and that's what it's also, it's so pervasive is one of the problems too. And some of the other paths that I chose put out there is that there's a good way to talk about Sbombs. How and would they help in this situation? I think they would be helpful, especially from the perspective of not the code and systems that you're building yourself, but the third-party software that you're deploying, third-party like the vendor appliances that you might have out there, where it's really hard to say, does this have Log4j inside it? Which harkens back to shell shock and heartbleed, for that matter. Do these appliances, do these devices have this very vulnerable flaw within them, and how do I know? And there's also things we could talk about, network controls and egress traffic, and ways of additionally basically saying we don't have to live day to day in fear of 0 days. We can hopefully improve some of the basics, asset inventory, to call back to our discussion with Francesco, as well as things like hardened network architectures and so on. But maybe we'll come back to this, or maybe we'll pull in a couple more of these as we hit some of the other topics, because I think we have some other interesting news that happened this week as well. In the spirit of the developers in Log4j, we're trying to deprecate this. There's also a spirit of, Mozilla developers trying to do the right thing, and in fact had a lot of good practices in place for their network security services library. There's a write-up from Tavis Ormandy from Project Zero, who found a bug that was basically saying that here's a bug that's relatively straightforward after the fact, once you know it's there, but it was found in his fuzzing methodology, but it wasn't found in the default fuzzing methodology that Mozilla has been executing. So I just wanted to kind of highlight that in the spirit of, you can still do all of the right things. You can still be maturing your processes, and bugs are going to sneak through. Now, that's not to downplay Log4j, because it is so pervasive. Lots of people had a really rough weekend trying to deal with legacy systems. But I guess where I'm trying to go there is that this will not be the only time we see a Log4j type of vuln. We saw it with, as I mentioned, shell shock, heartbleed. So hopefully there's a lot of things we can do as an AppSec industry to make it so the impact of these can be lessened, because we're doing something smarter, either investing in the open source software security foundation, Linux Foundation. They're doing a lot of great efforts on securing projects, or maturing processes, like we're pointing out with the fuzzing for this BigFix. John, I don't know if there's more that you wanted to note about this particular BigFix bug, but you also grabbed another article about some other sandbox work that Mozilla is doing.
Yeah, I want to spend a few minutes on this one, because I think it's on Travis's article. And it for those listening and catching up, playing along at home, it starts sort of slow. So read and put up with it. The initial, I thought I had a sense of it was being a little negative, and that's not where he's going at all. But the point being here, just really hammer it home, is we can't just depend on tools. Francesco had that cute phrase last hour. If you, I'm going to butcher it, but like if you believe purely in a tool, then you are a tool, I think is what he was saying. But these guys, they're not doing the basics. They put a really good amount of effort in doing this right. They're fuzzing, they're unit testing. It's, if you go and look at there's a link in the blog post to the code coverage report. And like the code's being exercised, right? I mean, I didn't see a percentage in here, but it's, there's lots of green. There's lots of lines being covered, but that's still not good enough. And I think that's what's, it'll give a lot of us, time to pause, even including me, to be honest. I'm, as I've said before, I'm very visual. So if I can, I do have those plugins in my IDEs that like tell me which one of my lines are my unit tests hitting, and go, oh, it's green, cool. I don't need to worry about that anymore. Okay, dude, well, you tested that line, but how did you test it, right? So now you have to go back through and really, I think there's going to be a lot of, there should be a lot of self-doubt about your testing abilities. I mean, they're even throwing fuzzers at this damn thing, and it still didn't catch it, because they had they told the fuzzer to not go over 10K characters when the buffer, I think, was 16K. And it's just, there's always space for improvement, I guess, right? But we can't just slap a tool on there. Even a good tool, even thinking we're going to best practices, you still got to go back and test further. And am I really doing this right? I think that's a bit of an eye opener for a lot of people. I hope it is.
Yeah, I think, and that reminded me too, because you focus on the, there's always more testing that could be done. But one of the other things that was really good about this is that this bug, in fact, could have been worse, but the software architecture of one of the other libraries that was potentially exposed through this particular bug was lessened just due to the design. So there's absolutely a lot of testing, as you're pointing out, but there's also stepping back and having kind of, I think, what Francesco was really advocating for, having that AppSec team and that DevOps team sit down and reason through what's our attack surface here? What could we change fundamentally that just says, let's, he used the term assume breach or assume bug or assume a flaw. Is there something that we can do that's some defensive programming? And I think that's a really good good mentality when you can get to that point and have those conversations, because it does lead you into conversations around things like the RTL box or RL box. Sorry.
Yep. And so you mentioned I threw an article in on this. I thought this was a fun one. In that, and I think Chrome's done some stuff, but this is sort of Firefox's latest and greatest approach to it. So RLBox is a WASM-based sandbox, so a WebAssembly-based sandbox for third-party libraries, which might be running in Firefox. So basically, divide and conquer is sort of what we're doing here. It's, I think, on the Log4J, I was going to comment around at the end there about, you started talking about defense in depth, but like it's so true. I've had people come to me recently, like one of the things I'm doing with IoT is I want the ability to turn the power off on a device in my house if I'm not going to use it. And he's like, dude, but like the remote control, it's a garage door opener. Let's get that out of the way. The remote control is like brand new, latest, greatest, top of the line. It's got like this, codes never repeated, all these type of things. Like, dude, if you never heard of security in depth, I'm not just going to trust a remote control because they said that on what gets to my house. If I can actually kill the power to the thing, now we're getting somewhere, right? But that's sort of the way I think, and that's sort of a little bit what they're trying to do here is, can we take some of those things which maybe we don't trust as much because we didn't write them ourselves, and leave aside that we're trusting what we wrote, but take that concept and run with it. And that's really what the idea they have here is the ability to use that for. They're going to start using it for some input. I think they're going to start using it for modules. They've been working on this for about a year. And yeah, there looks like they're actually doing some CSSs through it as well. So it's once you have something like this in your Swiss Army knife, there's a lot of different ways you can use it. So I think we're just seeing the beginning of this with Firefox. And by the way, Firefox 95, man, time flies. But it'll be interesting to see how this sort of comes up and how they use it over the next year or two.
Indeed. And what's really neat, too, is that they talk about some of the threat modeling as well to introduce why this RL box, why the sandbox is important, because they say, yes, there has been a great progress of process separation of all of the major browsers. It's a good thing, but process separation isn't always most appropriate, and it's not the only control we should be relying on. And they make a good case about saying we want to render fonts. Everything needs to render fonts, but why not just use this little WASM sandbox essentially for the font renderer rather than its own process? The same thing they talk about pointing out images, image handling. Again, a great notorious attack surface. And the other thing real quick from me on this particular topic, it stood out to me because it was behind this is a bunch of C++, some of the latest versions, latest features from C++ 17 about using type labels, type decoration to be able to go through some really neat cross-compiling essentially through Clang out of your C code into WASM and could even go back to C code for that matter if you wanted to with Clang. But it's really neat how they're using different languages here for security improvements. And I wanted to highlight that because there is a great progress towards memory safe languages. But of course, like Rust and Go, for example, getting away from the history of C and all of those, smashing the stack for fun and profit. Log4j, obviously, not a memory safety issue. I believe Shell Shock, not a memory safety issue. Heartbleed, I think that was a memory safety issue. So 2 out of 3 there, the biggest ones we've been talking about. But we had another article here that I think, was it on Go? I think it was a Go Path Traversal. And I mostly, of course, get your bingo cards. I pulled that out because of Path Traversal, my favorite. But it's another, Go, memory-safe language. It's still good to be moving towards those languages, but we can't forget all of the other attack classes that are going on here. And I've sort of talked myself into a corner there. I'm not sure where I want to go next. Turn the page, John. Choose your own adventure on these news articles. What should we tackle next?
Yeah, so let's we can look at the Go one for a second, then we can drop down into some of the Rust stuff I brought in, and we can have our language section of our news hour.
There we go.
And yeah, man, it's I know there's a lot of applications out there that need to interact with a file system. But like it is such a strong tell for me. Like as soon as I see like os.open, like that's the Go version, but like any, pick your language. As soon as I see something that looks like it's going to start playing with the file system, it's like, oh, what's going on here? So this is related to Grafana. And it's funny, I hadn't seen this till this morning. I'd heard about the Grafana CVE over the weekend, but it didn't occur to me that was Go and the connection there. So bad on me. But it's. I mean, I'm not sure how much there is to say here. It's another path traversal. Yeah. It comes down to what you're allowing into your application. Can't trust them people, whoever they are out there. I mean, there are. I didn't see if they're using them in here. There are a few functions in Go to clean up that path that's provided to you. So I'm not sure if they're using them. I'm just trying to look at the code real quick, and that's never going to work. But there are some things out there, I think, in the OS library, OS package, which would sort of, get rid of all the .. / that they're doing. But yeah, that's an example of that. What I will do is move from there over to Rust. And some more code that people can look at. We've got all sorts of code here in this week's episode in the show notes for those of you who want some homework or just to browse. And I'm trying to browse my tabs and find where the Rust one is. It is not there. Oh, come on, John. But anyways, I can talk while I'm looking for it. There it is. The second version of the patch to allow Rust codes to be written as part of the Linux kernel went in. And what's really interesting about this is, not so much, we've talked about Rust, we've talked about, all these different types of things, but one thing we try to do in the show here is instead of just, say, oh, hey, cool, Microsoft's using Rust for whatever device driver. Can I show you? Can I give you an example of like, if you want to bring this into your application, what do you need to think about? How do you need to do it? Do you put the code in a separate location? How does the Rust code interact with C code? So here you have a nice big fat patch from, it's Miguel, right? Yeah, Miguel Ojeda, sending into the Linux kernel. So talking about the infrastructure, talking about the compiler, what's going on, what he's doing, some of their customizations that they're doing to make it work better with Linux, some abstractions, examples about some drivers, and then the patch series. So this is email, which I'll link to, is one of 19, so it's sort of a large patch. But and I'm not going to say I read through the whole thing, but I think for folks who want to, it's one thing to like, when you bring a new technology on, but how do you actually use that? How do you make that part of your application? If you've got, I don't know, a few million lines of C or C++ or what have you, how do you bring another language in there and actually start making those things work? What some languages are better than others at this if they have some support for working with say like exporting their libraries so that they can be consumed by C or vice versa. But I think this is just a good example of how to do that, or how some really sharp people have been doing it. So for those who want a little light reading, there you go.
I'm glad you said that with a smile. It does stand out. Now, one of the things we also, as a callback to our interview segment as well, is context matters. And this context matters on talking about risk, talking about vulnerabilities, et cetera. Context matters for about what I'm about to say, but I'm still going to say it, pushing forward here, is I would love to know some of, what was the amount of work, both in developer hours, the patches, we can get a bit of a sense of lines of code added. Hopefully there were some lines of code deleted as well, but just to be able to introduce a language. And I'm going in that direction as we talk to the business, stakeholders, just try to get a sense of, here is the Linux kernel that has a few million lines of code. They went in a smart direction and said, hey, device drivers, very large attack surface. They're notoriously targeted, and it's also an area where we're relying on a lot of third-party code that has various levels of auditing. It's a great place to throw Rust into it, but just saying, cool, we're going to add Rust to the language. Even just looking at the first of 19 patches, there's a lot of work here. And I'd love to know just how much work, how many people, how many hours were put into doing that, just to give a level set of, say, this is a 1 month. No, it's not a 1 month effort. This is a 1 quarter. This is a half a year. This is a 1 year effort to put those onto roadmaps. And those are the types of conversations that I think Francesco was pointing towards when he was saying, having those stakeholder conversations, talk to the business about these topics.
Yeah, and it looks more like lines being added than not too many being removed. Hate to say it, but I mean, it's a new feature, so it sort of makes sense.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think you're bringing up a great point. There is this isn't a light thing, right? There's, I think, 4 or 5 people on the thanks acknowledgements on the patch. But as you read through the notes, and there's like, yeah, they've had like conferences and birds of feathers and like all sorts of meetings and discussions around this. So super expensive. But they're not just doing it for the giggles, right? They actually think they're going to get benefit out of this. So, we talk about that risk calculation, and when do we do it, and what do we get out of it? And here's that conversation, which is our last 30 seconds and 90 seconds, is that's what we need to be thinking about. Good point.
And it was helpful to jog my memory by checking out one of the other articles that I grabbed from Phil Venables. So, of course, we've covered, I think this is the 3rd article that we've covered from him in the past year. And this one is about reflections on the security profession. And it seems topical for what we've just been talking about right now, as well as Log4j and sort of, are we still in the firefighting mode, or we still have Log4j type of issues? Are we just focusing on that? And look at all the disciplines within security that had to come together in terms of responding to Log4j, whether it's your governance teams that are looking for asset inventories, your incident responders who are saying, have we been compromised by this? Is there a breach notification that's going to go out? Your AppSec team that's just trying to figure out where is it vulnerable? Your network security team that's trying to do some egress filtering, proxies, et cetera. I could go on and on. But this article is really good for saying, what are the disciplines that we have? There are many. There's a lot of ways, if you're trying to get into security, what should you be thinking of as a new security practitioner? It also calls out, what should the business be thinking of in terms of when they look to the security practice or, the security profession? And a lot of it is grounded in the idea of, how can we bring more science than gut feelings, how much more science than art, if you will, into the security profession? So I thought it was a really neat way to have a good, perhaps even end of year reflection on AppSec or security in general, as well as tying together, I think, a lot of the themes that we've touched on just this very episode.
Yeah, it's he's raising a bunch of points which they've been on our minds, but I think it's probably good to, as we're watching the ball drop on New Year's Eve, wherever we are in the world of, don't worry about whoever's around us or, celebrations or anything like that. Just think about AppSec in 2022. But it's, maybe not exactly then, but sometime over the holidays or next, even after in the new year is, are we educating enough people? How are we educating them? I think it's very clear, unfortunately, that we're still not getting the buy-in we need from upper management, I'll say. And that goes from, I'll filter my thoughts, but people can think of what I'm thinking of. That goes from large companies to small companies. That goes from, we can do as much of the right thing we can, like the Mozilla guys, but they're doing that because there was recognition and they were given encouragement to go down and put those controls in place, that testing in place, even though it wasn't quite perfect. But there's a lot of companies out there, vast majority, who like fuzzer, that word never got through at the front door or the back door. And I think that is because we're not putting enough resources behind what we're saying of, come on guys, it's 2022. We were talking with Francesco off air. We can't get asset inventory right. If I can't tell you, this was catchphrase at Qualys, it's probably been used by a bunch of other companies. I can't secure what I can't see. So if we can't get that type of, whether that's, we talked about Sbombs, we've talked about, actual assets, we've talked about vulnerabilities, we've talked about all these different types of things. If we don't have the basics of what's actually out there, so, maybe we just need to start training people with how to use magnifying glass and sort of go around our office and see what's going on, and maybe get the executives to do that. But I know I'll shut up. It's definitely something for us to think about, in hitting some pain points for me, obviously, but it's probably hitting the pain points for us as an industry, right? And we need to make more progress on that somehow.
No, indeed. It also reminds me, I'll throw on my deer stalker and grab a magnifying glass as I go looking for bugs. But I think your larger point, I think, is well made, is that we don't want to go as, I'll throw that pitch out there to make bug ops a phrase, is that's not a strategy. Chasing 0 days is not a strategy. We should be improving things, very much like how you were summarizing there at the end there, John. So I want to thank you for that summary. I want to thank everybody for listening. I'll remind you that we actually did have a couple other articles that we didn't quite get around to this news segment. So as always, please check out our show notes. As always, please check us out on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Give us a like, give us a 5-star rating if you're so inclined, and make sure to subscribe. And with that, we are going to not take a break. Well, we're going to take a week break as I gather my thoughts again, just to say thank you to everyone. It's time to ATH 0. That's what I was going for. My last dial-up reference of the day. We'll see you next week on Application Security Weekly.